Greetings. Today is Saturday, June 20th, 2026. This is meteorologist Ruben Garcia speaking. In today's video I will be discussing several topics. First, I will provide a brief summary of the current tropical cyclone activity in the Atlantic and the Eastern Pacific and review the areas we will be monitoring over the next 10 days. Then I will give an update on ENSO conditions. As you may already know, we now have El Niño conditions, which were officially declared by NOAA on June 15th. So I will take some time in this video to analyze how sea surface temperature anomalies are evolving across the Pacific Ocean and examine what is projected over the coming months with respect to El Niño. I will also review the climate changes anticipated across the Americas related to El Niño, particularly for late this year and early 27, so that we can all prepare for what could potentially become the strongest El Niño event on record. Then I will discuss how El Niño is already beginning to affect tropical cyclone activity and what is projected over the coming months in terms of cyclone formation in both the Atlantic and the Eastern Pacific. So let us begin by briefly discussing conditions in the Atlantic. At this time, we do not have any areas of concern for tropical cyclone development. This week we saw the formation of the first tropical storm, which was named Tropical Storm Arthur and brought historic flooding to portions of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. This storm has now dissipated, and its remnants are currently over the Atlantic. But aside from the remnants of Tropical Storm Arthur, there are currently no disturbances with any chance of tropical development over the next 7 days. As I mentioned in previous videos, we do have some strong tropical waves moving through the tropical Atlantic toward the Caribbean. However, atmospheric conditions are very stable, which will prevent tropical cyclone development. Instead, these tropical waves, such as the one reaching the Lesser Antilles this weekend, will bring some rainfall across the central and eastern Caribbean, where the rain will be welcome because we are beginning to see below normal precipitation anomalies, largely related to the effects of El Niño. Meanwhile, in the Eastern Pacific, there are currently no tropical cyclones. However, it is very likely that the coming weeks will be quite active, and this is also related to El Niño, which favors an active hurricane season in the Eastern Pacific. In fact, in the latest tropical weather outlook from the National Hurricane Center, an area in the Eastern Pacific was assigned up to a 20% chance of tropical development. For now, however, residents of Mexico can remain calm because projections indicate that if a tropical cyclone develops, it would move westward. Now let us take a look at the animation of sea surface temperature anomalies across the globe. As we have observed over the past several months, the most striking feature is that virtually the entire Pacific Ocean currently has sea surface temperatures much warmer than normal. In some areas, anomalies already exceed 2 degrees Celsius above average. The equatorial Pacific stands out, where we monitor ENSO conditions, and as I mentioned, El Niño conditions were officially declared on June 15th. Unfortunately, El Niño is projected to strengthen significantly over the coming weeks, and as you will soon see, anomalies in this region are at record levels for this time of year. This means it is likely that El Niño will continue strengthening and could become the strongest El Niño event on record. To give you an idea of how extreme these warm anomalies are in the Pacific, all of the areas outlined by these contours represent record sea surface temperatures dating back at least to 1982. In other words, since the satellite era began monitoring ocean temperatures in these regions, temperatures have never been this warm for this time of year, and this will undoubtedly have impacts on climate around the world. We can also see this in the graph, where average temperatures across the equatorial Pacific are near 29 degrees Celsius and are currently the highest observed for mid-June since 1940. Looking more closely at the Niño 3.4 region, where ENSO conditions are monitored, temperatures are currently at their highest level since 1982 for the month of June and rank as the second warmest temperature ever recorded during any time of year since 1982. This is particularly concerning because El Niño typically develops between April and June and strengthens through the fall, reaching peak intensity between October and February. In addition, El Niño conditions typically persist for 9 to 12 months, though occasionally they can last up to 2 years, and the phenomenon recurs every 2 to 7 years. What I am saying is that temperatures are very likely to continue increasing through the fall, and it is quite possible that a new record for the strongest El Niño on record will be established. The evidence that El Niño will continue strengthening becomes very clear when we examine ocean temperatures at depth across the equatorial Pacific. Since April, we have seen westerly wind anomalies push warm water from the western Pacific toward the central and eastern equatorial Pacific. These warm temperature anomalies extend deep into the ocean and continue moving eastward and upward toward the surface. In other words, El Niño will continue strengthening through the summer and fall. When we compare current conditions to past El Niño events, notice that temperature anomalies across the equatorial Pacific now far exceed the conditions observed during 2015, 1997, and 1982, which were among the strongest El Niño events on record. Now I would like to spend a few minutes discussing how this will affect climate conditions across the Americas, because El Niño not only affects tropical cyclone activity but also creates temperature and rainfall anomalies, both above and below normal. Let us begin with North America. El Niño typically produces warmer than normal temperatures across Canada and Alaska, which can significantly affect agriculture in the region, especially between November 2026 and June 2027. Meanwhile, across the southern United States and northern Mexico, El Niño tends to bring cooler temperatures and above normal precipitation, particularly between November 2026 and April 2027. Where the most significant impacts may be felt in the Americas is across Central America and northern South America, where El Niño creates below normal precipitation anomalies throughout Central America, generally year-round. We are particularly concerned about the Central American Dry Corridor, which extends across parts of Costa Rica, western Nicaragua, south-central Honduras, El Salvador, and much of southern Guatemala, where very dry conditions are projected. These conditions could lead to significant droughts, agricultural losses, and the displacement of vulnerable populations. Meanwhile, parts of Colombia and Venezuela are expected to experience dry conditions, particularly from September 2026 through February 2027, including portions of the Caribbean. In other areas of South America, including Peru and Ecuador, there is a greater probability of heavy rainfall and flooding, along with an increased risk of landslides and infrastructure damage. Meanwhile, portions of southeastern South America, including Uruguay, Paraguay, southern Brazil, and northern Argentina, could receive above normal rainfall and therefore face a greater flood risk, particularly between September 2026 and April 2027. Of course, El Niño creates unfavorable conditions for tropical cyclone activity in the Atlantic, which is why one of the least active hurricane seasons in decades is being forecast. Meanwhile, the opposite is expected in the eastern Pacific, where tropical cyclone activity is forecast to be well above normal. If we focus on how this will affect the hurricane season in the Atlantic and Pacific, we are already beginning to see signs that El Niño is influencing the atmosphere. Projections indicate that by late June, a favorable phase of the Madden-Julian Oscillation will become established across the central and eastern Pacific, creating optimal conditions for tropical cyclone formation while producing the opposite effect across the Atlantic, creating unfavorable conditions at least through early August. In fact, if El Niño continues strengthening, these conditions are likely to persist through the remainder of the hurricane season. Current conditions in the Atlantic are favorable for the generation of strong tropical waves emerging from Africa. To compare, look at the favorable phase of the Madden-Julian Oscillation currently over Africa, which has supported the formation of strong tropical waves. These waves have not been able to develop because of dry and stable atmospheric conditions, caused in part by cooler than normal sea surface temperatures across the tropical Atlantic. By comparison, look at projections for late July and early August, when models indicate that instability will become favored across the eastern Pacific. Models project a stationary and favorable phase for tropical cyclone formation across the eastern and central Pacific, while conditions remain unfavorable for cyclone formation in the Atlantic. This is why NOAA's Climate Prediction Center has highlighted the eastern Pacific as having a high probability of tropical cyclone development between June 24 and June 30, while maintaining forecasts of below normal precipitation across the Caribbean. The same pattern repeats for the period from July 1 through July 7, with tropical cyclone activity favored across the central and eastern Pacific, while drier than normal conditions persist across the Caribbean, Central America, and southern Mexico. Over the longer term, some models show the possible development of several tropical cyclones in the eastern Pacific. Meanwhile, over the next 15 days, the European model does not identify any areas with tropical development potential in the Atlantic. As I mentioned, these are effects of El Niño, but also of stable atmospheric conditions across the tropical Atlantic, caused largely by cooler than normal sea surface temperatures across the tropical Atlantic and near the Canary Islands. So I can honestly say that, for the time being, the Atlantic should remain fairly quiet, while the eastern and central Pacific are very likely to become more active in the coming weeks. Well, that is all for today's video. I hope our viewers are preparing for the strong El Niño event anticipated later this year. In particular, residents of the Caribbean, Central America, southern Mexico, Venezuela, and Colombia should prepare for below normal rainfall and potentially significant drought conditions. Here at Hurricane Info, I will continue monitoring the tropics to keep you informed. And if you enjoy this content, I invite you to like this video. Also, do not forget to subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so that you will be alerted whenever I post a new video. I hope everyone has an excellent weekend. See you next time.